Samuel Hayes had once stood tall in his marine blues, a figure of unwavering strength and discipline. Now, at 67, he drifted almost unseen through the weary veins of Fairhaven, Ohio, a town whose soul seemed to have cracked alongside its boarded-up storefronts and rusting factories. Each morning, Samuel would sling his battered duffel bag over one shoulder and shuffle through the back alleys and forgotten streets. The bag's seams were frayed, much like Samuel himself, ever since the day Caroline, his wife, his anchor, lost her battle with cancer. A battle that might have been won, had the VA hospital not misdiagnosed her for months. He had sat helplessly by her side, watching the light drain from her with each passing day. When the end finally came, Samuel sold their modest brick house on Tremont Avenue, gathered the proceeds, and, true to Caroline's final wishes, donated it all to the local animal rescue shelter she had adored. Afterward, he simply disappeared, not into the earth, but into a different kind of invisibility, the kind reserved for the broken-hearted and the forgotten. Some battles end with medals, Samuel once murmured to a kindly church volunteer who had offered him a cup of coffee one snowy morning. Others end with silence. Samuel never begged. He refused to surrender the last piece of dignity he had. Instead, he survived by collecting aluminum cans, scrapping for change, and living off leftover kindness from a few places like Marcy's Diner, where the waitresses slipped him coffee and the occasional sandwich without fuss. Most people, however, chose to cross the street rather than see him. As December's bitter cold settled into Fairhaven's bones, Samuel grew weaker. His coat, a relic from better days, was threadbare. His boots leaked snowmelt. Hunger gnawed at him with feral persistence. By the third day without a real meal, his hands were shaking so badly he struggled even to lift them. That afternoon, desperate and dizzy, Samuel stumbled into Paxton's grocery, a squat building with a sagging awning and a cracked open sign. It smelled of old produce and cleaner, but to Samuel, it was an oasis. He lingered near the produce section, eyeing a bin of bruised apples and day-old rolls piled haphazardly in a crate marked 50% off. His stomach twisted painfully. No one was watching. Mr. Paxton, the owner, was busy helping an elderly woman at the register. The single teenage stock boy was stacking cans at the far end of the store. Samuel hesitated, the moral weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. But the hunger was stronger. With trembling fingers, he slipped a battered apple into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then a hard roll. His hands were so cold he could barely fasten the coat over them. He made his way toward the door, head bowed low, when a voice barked out, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Samuel froze. Mr. Paxton, his face purple with anger, marched toward him. I, Samuel stammered. But it didn't matter. Paxton had already reached for the phone, stabbing at the keys. "Police." "Now," Paxton growled. "We don't tolerate thieves around here." Samuel didn't resist. He simply stood there, hollow-eyed and exhausted, his meager prize still tucked under his coat. Within minutes, a squad car pulled up. The fluorescent lights flickered harshly as two officers entered. Derek Collins, a burly man with a buzz cut, and Maria Lopez, whose keen brown eyes immediately spotted the dog tags peeking from beneath Samuel's collar. "You served?" she asked quietly, as Collins spoke loudly into his radio. Samuel managed a small nod. "Long time ago, when it mattered." Officer Lopez hesitated just for a moment, but procedure was procedure. And so, before the scattered evening shoppers of Fairhaven, Samuel Hayes was handcuffed and escorted from Paxton's grocery, his dignity stripped away like an old, tattered coat. Outside, some people stared. Others looked away, uncomfortable. No one stepped forward. No one asked if there was more to the story. The mugshot captured not just Samuel's face, but the deep lines etched there. Not just by age, but by sorrow, loneliness, and a country that had once saluted him but now barely acknowledged him. That night, as he sat in the municipal holding cell, Samuel carefully drew out a small, tattered photograph from inside his shirt. Caroline's face smiled up at him, soft, bright, and forever young. He whispered into the cold, empty room, I'm trying, love. I'm trying. Outside the barred window, the winter wind howled. And somewhere beyond that, destiny stirred. Morning in the Fairhaven Municipal Court was a gray, mechanical thing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering now and then as the worn floor tiles echoed with the shuffled steps of the weary, the desperate, and the defeated. Samuel Hayes shuffled in with the others, his boots scraping tiredly along the floor. The same tattered jacket hung from his bony shoulders, the fabric now stiff from last night's damp cold. His wrists ached from the cuffs, though the officers had not been unkind. It wasn't cruelty that bruised him, it was indifference. No family waited for him on the cracked wooden benches. No friends whispered encouragement from the gallery. Just Samuel, hunched small at the defendant's table, his duffel bag tucked between his scuffed boots, as if it might still protect something precious inside. The clerk, a young woman with harried eyes and a bored tone, droned through the morning's docket. Case 19-842. The State versus Samuel Hayes. Samuel stood when his name was called, swaying slightly. His knees felt like brittle sticks. He could feel the quiet murmurs ripple through the courtroom. A few curious glances landed on him, then slid away, some with mild disgust, others with empty pity. At the prosecutor's table stood a young man named Alan Pierce, crisp in his blue suit, a fresh bar exam certificate still metaphorically clinging to his lapel. Pierce spoke briskly, as if Samuel were an item to be moved along the morning's conveyor belt. "Your Honor," Pierce began. The defendant was apprehended while committing a petty theft at Paxton's grocery. Surveillance footage confirms the theft. The defendant has no fixed address, no employment, prior minor citations for loitering and public intoxication. The state recommends remand until trial to prevent further offenses. Judge Thomas Whitaker, a stern figure with silver hair and wire-framed glasses, barely glanced at Samuel at first. His fingers tapped against the stack of arrest reports on his bench, moving from case to case with rote efficiency. He flipped open Samuel's file, expecting to find the same parade of sadness he saw daily, when something slipped loose between the papers. It was a worn, scratched military dog tag, attached to a thin chain. It clattered quietly onto the judge's bench. Whitaker stilled. He leaned forward and, for the first time, looked directly at Samuel. Really looked. The name stamped into the metal caught his breath. Hayes Samuel J. USMC. Blood type O+. Something deep in Whitaker's chest stirred. A memory he hadn't called on in years. Muddy boots, gunfire cracking the air, the burning stench of diesel and blood. "Request a 5-minute recess," Judge Whitaker said abruptly, interrupting the prosecutor mid-sentence. The clerk blinked, startled. Pierce hesitated, confused. Whitaker didn't wait for approval. He rapped his gavel once, sharp and final. "Recess granted. Counsel, approach," he ordered, rising from his bench and disappearing into his chambers. Samuel stood there, dazed. Around him, the courtroom buzzed with quiet confusion. No one had ever stopped the march of procedure for him before. No one had ever interrupted a system already moving to swallow him whole. He sat slowly, not daring to hope, not daring to think too far ahead. Meanwhile, behind the heavy oak doors of his chambers, Judge Whitaker stood staring down at the dog tag he held in his palm. Samuel Hayes. He closed his eyes and let the years roll back. Fallujah 2004. The second battle. The ambush. He could still feel the searing heat of the blast that had torn through their convoy. Could still hear the ragged screams of men pinned under twisted metal. He could still remember the moment when a figure had hauled him bodily out of a burning Humvee, ignoring flying bullets, ignoring his own wounds. It had been Samuel Hayes, a man who had bled and fought and saved others without thought of reward, now sitting in an orange jumpsuit over a bruised apple and a roll. Judge Whitaker sat heavily in his chair, the file still open in front of him. The entries stabbed at his heart. Discharged honorably, 2005. 3 tours overseas. Bronze Star recipient. Termination of VA benefits, 2007. Reason: no known address. The next line was the most damning of all. Case closed. Closed. As if a man's life could simply be filed away and forgotten because he had no mailing address. Whitaker ran a trembling hand through his hair. "God forgive us," he whispered. He knew in that moment that the law, the cold, indifferent law, had abandoned Samuel long before this petty theft ever happened. Back in the courtroom, Samuel hunched further into his seat, feeling the hostile air pressing down on him. A young woman in the gallery, maybe a law student, maybe a reporter, watched him with wide, curious eyes. But no one spoke. No one approached. The minutes stretched painfully. At last, the heavy doors opened, and Judge Whitaker emerged. But something about him had changed. Gone was the detached professionalism. Instead, he walked slowly, deliberately, his face set with a gravity that hushed even the whispered side conversations. He took his seat and looked straight at Samuel again. "Mr. Hayes," he said, voice low but firm, "before this court proceeds, I am ordering an immediate review of your military records and visa status. This case will be stayed until further notice." The prosecutor sputtered an objection, but Whitaker silenced him with a raised hand. Furthermore, the judge continued, "This court is requesting assistance from the Veterans Legal Defense Network to provide Mr. Hayes with pro bono representation effective immediately." Gasps fluttered through the courtroom. Samuel blinked, not understanding. Whitaker leaned forward slightly, his voice softening just a fraction. "You are not invisible here, Staff Sergeant." The title hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Samuel bowed his head, hiding the sudden sting in his eyes. Outside the courthouse windows, snow began to fall, slow, quiet, and pure. For the first time in years, Samuel felt something he had nearly forgotten. Not hope, but the memory of it. And sometimes that was enough to start. That night, in the silence of his tiny cell, Samuel Hayes sat on the narrow bunk, staring at the stained ceiling. He cradled the photograph of Caroline in his rough hands, her smile, still radiant after all these years, warming the chilled corners of his heart. "If you're lost, Samuel," her voice echoed from some soft, worn place inside him, "it's not forever. I'll wait for you." The words had been her comfort to him during his darkest deployments. Now, in the sterile loneliness of Fairhaven's jail, they were all he had left. The guards treated him politely enough, but with that clinical distance reserved for the broken and forgotten. He ate a small tray of watery stew and a stale roll, but most of it remained untouched. Hunger no longer gnawed at him. It had been replaced by a colder emptiness. In the adjoining cell, a younger inmate, all bravado and bitterness, sneered as Samuel shifted painfully on his bunk. "Another old-timer thinking the world owes him," the boy muttered, loud enough for Samuel to hear. "Bet you made up all them war stories too. PTSD, yeah right?" When Samuel didn't respond, the kid pushed harder, giving Samuel a rough shove as he walked past to the sink. Samuel stumbled against the metal bunk, catching himself on the frame. Still, he said nothing. No rage, no retaliation, just a quiet endurance honed over too many years of fighting battles no one ever saw. Back in his seat, Samuel let the anger roll over him and away. He simply pressed Caroline's picture to his chest, whispering so softly it was almost prayer. "Just holding on, darling. Just holding on." Across town, in his dimly lit chambers, Judge Thomas Whitaker bent over stacks of documents and old military files. A pot of burnt coffee sat untouched beside him. He had pulled Samuel's military service record, and the more he read, the more a knot of shame twisted tighter inside his gut. Samuel's file was a tapestry of sacrifice. Bronze Star for Valor 2003, for shielding wounded comrades during a mortar attack. 2 Purple Hearts, awarded for injuries sustained saving civilians during a street ambush. Combat Action Ribbon, for direct engagement under enemy fire. And there, among the commendations, were mentions of Samuel's acts of humanity too. Letters from fellow Marines and even Iraqi civilians, describing a man who had not just fought wars, but carried wounded children, shared scarce food with strangers, taught young Marines to read and write in the dusty evenings between patrols. A true shepherd, in the worst of storms. Whitaker leaned back heavily, covering his face with his hands. How had they let him slip through the cracks? The answer was simple. They hadn't slipped. They had shoved him. When Samuel returned from his final deployment in 2005, Caroline had been waiting. But the PTSD, unacknowledged and untreated, had eaten at him like rust. When Caroline fell sick, he had tried to fight for her, too. Tried to navigate the VA's impossible bureaucracy. But a missed appointment here, a lost piece of paperwork there, and their small, fragile life had crumbled. By 2007, with Caroline gone, Samuel had no address to anchor him. No address, no benefits. No benefits, no survival. Forgotten by the nation he had fought for. Until now. Whitaker closed the file and reached for the phone. The next morning, Samuel sat shackled in the transport van, bumping along the icy streets back to the courthouse. He didn't expect anything different. More hearings. More polite apologies masked as legal procedures. More slow erosion. The bailiff unshackled him outside courtroom 3. "Straight inside, Sergeant," the bailiff said softly. "Sergeant." The word struck Samuel like a sudden hand to the chest. Inside, the atmosphere was different. The courtroom was full. Not with angry citizens or bored lawyers, but with soldiers. 3 Marine officers stood at attention at the back of the courtroom, dressed in immaculate dress blues, the sharp creases in their trousers as crisp as razors. Behind them, a crowd of men and women in civilian clothes, some in old, proud veteran ball caps, others holding small American flags folded neatly against their chests. Samuel stopped short, overwhelmed. At his defense table sat a sharply dressed woman, a leather briefcase beside her chair. She rose when she saw him. "Staff Sergeant Hayes?" she said, her voice calm but strong. "My name is Rebecca Monroe, Veterans Legal Defense Network. I'm here to represent you." Samuel blinked, stunned. I don't have money for a lawyer." "You don't need it," she said with a small, fierce smile. "You have the truth." At the bench, Judge Whitaker adjusted his glasses and nodded at Samuel. "Mr. Hayes," he said, voice clear and steady. "This court has been made aware of extraordinary circumstances regarding your history and service." The prosecutor, looking deeply uncomfortable, didn't even try to interrupt. Whitaker continued. "We will be hearing critical testimony today on your behalf, and the court will act accordingly." Rebecca placed a reassuring hand on Samuel's arm as Colonel Eric Dunham, one of the officers, took the stand. In measured, precise terms, Colonel Dunham detailed Samuel's valor, his sacrifices, his unwavering loyalty to his fellow Marines and to civilians alike. He presented hard evidence that Samuel's VA pension had been wrongfully terminated, robbing him not only of financial security but of the vital mental health care he so desperately needed. "The injustice inflicted upon this man," Colonel Dunham finished, "is not merely a clerical error. It is a moral failure, and it demands correction." The words rang in the courtroom's heavy silence. Judge Whitaker's voice broke slightly as he spoke. "This court recognizes Staff Sergeant Samuel Hayes not as a vagrant or criminal, but as a decorated hero whose dignity we collectively failed to honor." He turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have anything further?" The young man, eyes glistening, shook his head. "The state moves to dismiss all charges. With prejudice." The gavel fell once, twice, sealing the words into official record. Dismissed. Gone. Samuel stood there, uncertain, as the room erupted. Not into applause, but into something deeper. The quiet rustling of people rising to their feet, hands pressed respectfully over hearts, heads bowed. The Marine officers saluted him, not as a pitying gesture, but as one warrior to another. For the first time in almost 2 decades, Samuel Hayes stood tall, unbroken, and seen. Samuel Hayes stood motionless as the courtroom rose to its feet around him. The moment stretched, suspended in a silence so profound it hummed in his ears. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, feeling the warmth of so many unseen hands lifting the crushing weight he had carried for years. Slowly, shakily, Samuel lifted his hand and returned the Marine officer's salute. His palm trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the unbearable flood of emotion surging through a heart that had all but forgotten how to hope. The bailiff approached respectfully, no longer a guard but a silent witness to something sacred. "Sergeant Hayes," the bailiff said softly. "You're free to go, sir." "Sir." Samuel's throat tightened painfully at the sound. As he stepped away from the defendant's table, the gallery parted like a tide. Veterans, soldiers, strangers, all making room, all acknowledging something that had been invisible for too long. Near the courtroom door, a small commotion stirred. A young woman with tear-bright eyes and trembling hands rushed forward, pushing through the gathered crowd. "Uncle Sam!" she cried. Samuel turned, bewildered. It had been years since anyone called him that. The young woman threw her arms around him before he could even react, clutching him fiercely. For a moment, Samuel stood stiff, stunned by the human contact. Then his arms slowly, almost fearfully, came up to hold her. "It's me, Ellie, Caroline's niece." Samuel pulled back to study her face. It was there, the trace of Caroline's laughter in the corners of her mouth, the same stubborn spark in her brown eyes. "I found you," she whispered, voice breaking. "I've been looking for you since Aunt Caroline passed. You just disappeared." Samuel could barely breathe. "I thought there was nothing left," he rasped. "You're not alone," Ellie said fiercely. "Not anymore." Reporters snapped photos as the unlikely reunion unfolded, but no one intruded. Even they seemed to understand that this was sacred ground. Outside the courthouse, the biting wind carried the scent of fresh snow and something sharper, the sharp, clean air of change. On the steps, Judge Whitaker approached Samuel quietly. His robe gathered around him like a soldier's battered cloak. "You saved my life once, Staff Sergeant," he said, offering his hand. Samuel shook it, the two men gripping each other's arms like brothers in a forgotten war. "And now," Whitaker added, his voice thick with emotion, "I intend to help you reclaim yours." True to his word, within days, Whitaker personally oversaw the filing of a petition to reinstate Samuel's full veterans' benefits, retroactively. Veterans' legal defense worked alongside him, moving mountains that once seemed immovable. The VA, faced with overwhelming evidence and public pressure after Samuel's story hit the national news, issued a formal apology, the first of its kind, acknowledging the grievous mishandling of Samuel's case. A check for nearly $278,000 in back pay was delivered by hand. But more importantly, Samuel was enrolled in a specialized veterans housing program, offered comprehensive medical care, and introduced to a community of fellow veterans who welcomed him without judgment. 1 month later, Fairhaven held a ceremony at City Hall. They called it a celebration of honor, but it was more than that. Banners lined the streets, children waved small flags, and old veterans dusted off their uniforms. Businesses donated food, musicians played in the square, and the air buzzed with a reverence usually reserved for forgotten holidays. When Samuel stepped onto the stage, wearing a new, neatly pressed coat over his marine dress blues, his medals gleaming, the crowd erupted into a standing ovation that rolled like thunder through the town. Judge Whitaker presented him with a plaque, inscribed with simple but searing words, "For service, sacrifice, and unseen valor, Fairhaven remembers." Samuel cleared his throat, clutching the podium with both hands. He wasn't used to speaking anymore, especially not to so many faces turned toward him, waiting not for apology, but for his voice. "I didn't save lives for medals," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I didn't fight for thanks. I fought because a man doesn't leave others behind." He paused, the sea of faces blurring slightly as emotion rose. "But when you come home," he said, "you hope, maybe, that someone will come back for you too." A hush fell. "And you did," he whispered. The crowd seemed to breathe as one, 1,000 hearts breaking and mending in the same moment. After the ceremony, as twilight painted the town in gold and lavender, Samuel sat quietly on a bench in the park, the same bench where he had once eaten scraps with only the winter wind for company. Beside him sat Ellie, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. Rocky, a service dog donated by a veterans foundation, dozed at Samuel's feet, a loyal companion for the new chapters ahead. Children played nearby, their laughter ringing like bells. The flag above City Hall fluttered in the gentle breeze, casting shifting shadows across Samuel's face. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out Caroline's photograph. "Found my way back, love," he whispered, tracing her smile with his thumb. "Just like you said I would." Above him, the first star of the evening blinked into existence, and Samuel Hayes, invisible no longer, smiled into the coming night, knowing that even the longest winters end, and even the most forgotten heroes can find their way home.